Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. We have two panels this morning. And our study, of course, is exploring employment opportunities for persons with disabilities. We have three groups that will be sharing with us today, and so we do want to get started for sure. We have here with us Dawn Brayton, who I've met with previously, and Carmela Hutchinson from Disabled Women's Network of Canada. Dawn. And we also have with us Keenan Wellar from Live, Work, Play, and Frank Smith from the National Educational Association of Disabled Students. So we'll now go to Mr. Wellar. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Appreciate those comments. A lot of it ditto for much of that. I will also echo the sentiment that we need to look at targeting those with the greatest barriers, recognizing that certain disability subgroups, such as people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, face more serious and severe attitudinal and systemic barriers, those that are unlikely to be overcome in a significant way if we approach the employment of people with disabilities as though they are a homogenous group. They are not. They are very different individually, but also as groups, and sometimes the groups merge and are complicated. So my experience is as a local provider, not only of employment supports, but supporting people with intellectual disabilities to live, work, and play in the Ottawa community. And so part of that is helping people find employment and helping employers welcome them to their workplaces. So through that experience, I've seen a lot of what works and what doesn't work, and that's kind of what I'd like to talk about. I'm also a volunteer with the United Way Ottawa. I'm one of the first focus area champions, where I go out and speak about the advantages of hiring people with disabilities and promoting attitudinal change in that area. So with respect to employment, I just wanted to bring home some of the local context, because right now within sight of this great building down at the Weston, one of our Live, Work, Play members is actually at work right now in the accounts department. If we move a little bit west on O'Connor Street, we support an individual who runs a small business where he works with Accenture. If we go south on Bank Street to the Works Gourmet Burger Bistro, we've got someone there right now helping out with the lunch rush. So just to give some local perspective, that's what we do, and they're real people right here in your local community. We are a local organization with a local focus, but we try to inform our work by best practices from across the province, the country, and the world. Some of the gentlemen you had sitting here, in fact, right in this seat, you had Mark Wafer, Cam Crawford. These are people I'm very familiar with, and again, would echo much of their comments, so I'm grateful. I don't really need to bring that context. We just need more Mark Wafers in Canada, and our country would be a much better place, and a better place for people with disabilities. We also work with the Ontario Disability Employment Network. I know that Joe Dale also testified here as well. We're quite aligned with those comments. And locally, we're part of the Employment Accessibility Resource Network, hosted by United Way Ottawa. It's bringing together about 30 service providers and employers, and I think reflects well what the panel was saying in their report about promoting not only the benefits of hiring people with disabilities, but also how to connect people like ourselves that know these individuals and can connect with an employer and help communicate the benefits and finding the right job for the right person. I see how fast time flies, so I'm going to skip ahead. One thing I wanted to do, I know it's common to talk about best practices, but I want to talk a little bit about worst practices, because I think that's important. In these times when it's a constant dialogue of scarcity of resources, I think we can't only emphasize the positive. We have to look at where our resources are being used perhaps ineffectually or even in a regressive manner. One of the things that certainly concerns us and our partner organizations is segregated and or sub-minimum wage environments, work environments. So in the field of developmental services, as it's labeled in Ontario, we see scarce government dollars continuing to flow to practices and activities that not only fail to support community inclusion, but in fact create barriers and have regressive impacts. A lot of this is covered in the CACL report on achieving social and economic inclusion, where they note, although enrollments in sheltered workshops are slowly declining, segregated day programming and enclave-based employment persist as a dominant model of support for this group in Canada, with below minimum wage compensation They constitute a form of financial exploitation and social and economic exclusion, which substantially lower quality of life outcomes. This has certainly been our experience, having supported people who have been in these segregated situations. Perhaps have been told that is because you do not have opportunities or a future or a possibility in the real workforce. This has been proven wrong time and time again, and that the greatest barrier was in fact that message to them and to their family members that you will not have success with employment. So this segregated arrangement, work-like arrangement, is what's best for you. And I would note that in some ways the Government of Canada does support that practice by sometimes contracting with these agencies that where basically you have a salaried staff member like myself who is supervising a bunch of people with disabilities who are being paid at sub-minimum wage to perform a task. So I would encourage looking internally at what goes on there and dealing with that, because it's wonderful that there's this talk about best practices, but I think leadership through demonstration is critically important. Another worst practice, this is more of a fear, I guess, is going forward. Again, in a dialogue of scarcity, sometimes there's a tendency towards a one-size-fits-all. It sounds economically efficient. Let's send everybody with a disability who's looking for a job to the same place. Then we'll save on various costs. The problem is that tends to incentivize the marginalization of those who are most difficult to serve, because the metric by which performance of those career centers is usually measured is simply how many jobs. So it's not a one job equals one job situation. If you've got a person with an intellectual disability who is in a group that is, facing 75% or higher unemployment, and they get a job, that is a very different outcome from someone with a PhD who's sustained a workplace injury and has been supported to return to work. I'm not saying that is not important, just that it's very different. And if you count those two things as the same outcome, then the most marginalized people are unlikely to benefit from that perspective. Years ago, a young man came to our office, actually his mother, but he was there too, in a rage because her son had been assessed by a career center as having a 3 out of 100 score in employability. That is not a very good message to receive. Long story short, he has now been working for TD Bank locally here in Ottawa for more than a decade, has full salary, pension, everything. And that is obviously not the outcome or not the destination that had been determined for him through that initial assessment. So we need to be wary of that. And if we do have people going through the same door, we have to make sure that through the other side there are people who understand the particular needs of different disability groups and subpopulations, because those are very specialized skills. What we do in terms of the work we do with employers and developing those relationships is not the same as helping someone prepare a resume and look through job postings. That's one type of job support.
Bring it to a conclusion.
Sure. Worst practice 3, wage subsidies. The Opportunities Fund tends to require that people like ourselves would use wage subsidies in our program delivery. So that pretty much excludes us from being involved, because we will not do that, because it is not an effective practice for us. It gives the employer a message that the person is worth less than another person. So they have to be used very carefully and not applied exclusively to people with disabilities. On a positive note, I have provided a briefing, about 16 pages, with many different positive stories from small business as well as franchises as well as corporations who are all working effectively and employing people with intellectual disabilities, because it's a good business case and also because they believe their workplace should reflect the communities around them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for presenting your brief. It certainly contained a lot of information, and it's an interesting perspective looking at ineffective and regressive practices as well. Something we need to keep in mind. Mr. Mays, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'd like to direct my first question to Mr. Wellar. When you were discussing your opening remarks, you said that different disability groups, you used that term, and the one thing that kind of struck me is that are the programs that are out there today, are they disability specific in their application? So do you see the need for a more specific target for programs for people with certain disabilities? And is there any success stories that you can provide as a framework for future initiatives for the government to take that would be supporting that?
Yes, so there are obviously many different disability subgroups, and ideally we're going to arrive at a point in our society where not only is disability not a factor, we're all just citizens, but obviously we're not going to have these subgroups. But right now, you can't discuss employment of people with disabilities without realizing you're also discussing human rights and discrimination. So there are certain groups that historically are just now even approaching the start of citizenship. So people with intellectual disabilities is one of those groups. Like, they're just starting to live in our neighborhoods. They're just starting to shop and work and travel in our communities. So within that context, it's quite different providing employment supports to such an individual because not only are there going to be different attitudinal barriers, but they themselves will have different ways of thinking about work, and most likely those entering the working age have not had, for example, summer job experience, or perhaps not even gone through school with the idea that they will one day have a job. So as a provider ourselves, a lot of our work starts with that yes, you can work. And as opposed to maybe a career center where what qualifies someone to be seeking a job is a long resume and these sorts of things, what qualifies it for us is the person that said, I want to work. And we operate on that basis. So I think that's why you see these differences, because it kind of depends where you are on that whole developmental spectrum of as a person with a disability and where you are on that human rights scale. And what was the second aspect of your question? I'm sorry.
Is there existing programs that have provided, or have you put together some programs that have provided some guidance for the government as far as being more specific as far as the funding or programming?
I think the Ontario Disability Employment Network, Joe Dale that testified, they have some excellent examples of that. It's providers like ourselves, but they have the collection of these stories. We have some excellent local stories we can certainly share. But there you're going to find a lot of best practices, and there's going to be a lot of commonality throughout those, and a lot of it will have to do with the fact that we look at it as developing a relationship with employers. For us, it's not so much about searching job postings and fitting a candidate. There's often a lot of work to be done in developing a relationship with an employer who has said specifically, we believe in a diversified workplace here, and this is a group that we realize we have excluded to some degree or completely, and so we have chosen to work with you to change that.
First, I just want to commend all of you for the work that you do. I have an older sister that has a disability, and I can recall as a 16-year-old driving her and two other ladies to a workshop, and it was interesting because one of the ladies actually was kept in the attic in their home for most of her younger years because of the stigma of having a child that had a disability. And we have come a long ways, and our government, by taking this initiative to do this study, shows that we want to go further and be more inclusive.
We will conclude with Mr. Cuzner. You've got a few minutes, so if you could...
Thanks. If I can get two questions in, and then if I can come back for a third, but thank you all for being here today. My first one would be to Mr. Wellar, and then I'm going to Ms. Hutchinson. You talked about the segregated wage subsidy programs and the sub-minimum wage jobs. If you could talk a little bit about the work that's being done by those workers now, and what should we be doing differently?
Thank you for your question. I think this points to why we do need somewhat of a disability-specific lens, because there isn't any other population that is working in these sub-minimum wage situations, for example. If it was people with PhDs who happen to use a wheelchair, obviously there is a law against them working for less than minimum wage, but we somehow found a way that this is acceptable for certain people. So, where is that happening? Well, here in Ottawa, some of the jobs has to involved with recycling of paper. Also, there's a program for watering plants in government buildings. And I found most people employed in the federal government are unaware that those individuals are working for $1 an hour or whatever the current wage is. So I would encourage some internal exploration of what's going on there. And obviously the best practice would be, let's find out how we can directly employ those people as federal government workers rather than this current arrangement. If they need support, That's what an employment supports provider is for, to help them get to where they need to be to do that job competently. But to have these sorts of really 30-year-old arrangements that the obstacles report in 1981 talked about. So it's 30 years later, and it's still going on. I realize there's wonderful things happening, but we need to get...
Just a moment. Yes. I think you have a point of order.
Just on a point of order, and I may have misheard you, and so please correct me if this is the case, but my understanding is that the witness said that the federal government was setting wages of like $1 or $1.25. Just so we're very clear, the provinces set minimum wages. It is not the responsibility of the federal government to set minimum wages. They're set by the provinces. So I don't appreciate, and maybe I misinterpreted you, that the innuendo was that the government of Canada was paying individuals $1 or $1.25.
Okay, I'm not sure that's point of order, and I don't know whether you want to make a clarification, but carry on.
Just to clarify, what I'm saying is that there are contractual arrangements whereby there is people on federal properties that are doing work. However, it's come to be. I realize they're not federal employees.
Fair enough, and I think anyone else wishes to comment, go ahead, and then we'll conclude with that. Anyone else wish to make a remark? Go ahead, Ms. Hutchinson. We'll conclude. I do
know that in some provinces there is actually legislation that permits the practice that Mr. Wellar referred to, and that does sadly happen, and it also happens for people with mental illness who are working in psychiatric settings.
Okay. All right, thank you very much for that. Thank you for appearing before this committee and presenting very useful information. Thank you very much. We'll adjourn with that.